Shigeru Miyamoto is extremely well known amongst gamers as being the grandfather of video games. He has created most of Nintendo's biggest franchises, such as Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong, and The Legend of Zelda. These successes guided him into a position to have meaningful input in other games Nintendo produced. For example, he had a lot of ideas for the Star Fox series, Kid Icarus, and the F-Zero games. Using these franchises, Miyamoto single-handedly brought Nintendo to fame and changed video games forever. If it wasn't for a certain giant gorilla and a certain jumping plumber created by Miyamoto, Nintendo wouldn't have the opportunities it did to create all the amazing things Nintendo has done for the video game industry. Nintendo created the Rumble Pack that allowed the Nintendo 64 controller to vibrate, which became a standard in video game controllers, and Miyamoto, with the Legend of Zelda games, created the battery backup that allowed video games to be saved. Most notably nowadays, Nintendo brought motion controls into the mainstream and coming very close to perfecting it with the Motion Plus controller. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Shigeru Miyamoto was hired as an apprentice at Nintendo in 1977. Nintendo was struggling to get a hit arcade game into the arcades for years. They tried with games such as Sheriff, Space Firebird, and Radar Scope, but were generally unsuccessful. Finally, they settled on an idea of a game where a gorilla would capture a carpenter's girlfriend, and the object of the game is to rescue her. In 1981, this game was known as Donkey Kong, and Shigeru Miyamoto's first video game he ever directed. The game did well in Japan, however, it exploded in the US and made Nintendo lots and lots of money. The game was so popular, it was ported to multiple video game consoles, such as the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision. This was the game that put Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto on the map, so naturally Miyamoto was brought back to direct the sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., a year later. It wasn't as big a hit as the first Donkey Kong, but nevertheless, gamers still enjoyed it. Nintendo was working long and hard to create their new home console. They needed games for it to really show what their new system could do. Miyamoto was called in to help design some of the games. Two of the games he worked on was Excitebike and Ice Climbers. He did not direct these two, he merely designed them. The big game he actually directed was Super Mario Bros. This is quite possibly the best known video game in history. Everyone knows the music, everyone knows the controls, and everyone knows the story. It's so popular, some people still play it to this day, and in this year, 2015, it will be 30 years old. Now that is quite a legacy a plumber can leave behind. The game was pretty much made as a system seller. The controls were incredibly precise that really showed off the new controller they were pushing.
Not to mention, there was a very small amount of games back then that consisted of more than one screen. Most games at the time consisted of one screen at a time. When you reached the end, you progressed to the next level. But in this game, it consisted of several screens throughout each level, and compared to the other games that were coming out at the time, a very lengthy game if you went from start to finish without using any secrets.
Shigeru Miyamoto knew exactly what had to happen in this game. They needed secrets to get people talking, they needed to have mechanics to toy around with, they needed different locations to show off the different places in the world. The game actively encourages exploration to break the rules of the game, for example, the best known secret in a video game, jumping on the ceiling and skipping the whole level. Mario was such a popular game, he became a world-beloved character, ingraining himself in magazines, TV, even a blockbuster movie. Bottom line, it's a game that should rightfully be called the Citizen Kane of video games, making the template of what video games should be and how they should feel. The next year, in 1986, Nintendo still had the smash hit with Super Mario Bros., but still wasn't a grounded household name like, for example, Atari. So Nintendo gave Shigeru Miyamoto the task to create another great game that they could possibly make into another franchise. And he did just that. It started out as a simple adventure game as a boy, Link, who walks around stabbing bad guys and solving puzzles to save Princess Zelda and defeat the evil Ganon. When you get down to the bare story of this game, it's pretty much the same as Super Mario Bros. Saving Princess from bad guy scenario, but this game took it a step forward. The enemies were more difficult, there were puzzles you had to solve, items to buy and equip, and the world was even better. This game is one of the first examples to technically have an open world where you walk around and do whatever you want. It's not the same type of open world that modern games have, such as Batman Arkham City or Red Dead Redemption, that included some missions throughout the game, although there was a second quest after you completed the main game in Zelda. Zelda was a big deal when it came out, and it still is today. Gamers nowadays take Zelda very seriously, becoming sort of the Lord of the Rings of video games. While the Super Mario series continues to be the best-selling franchise of all time, the Legend of Zelda franchise will forever continue to be the largest franchise of all time.
From its characters, its story, the timeline of the games, and of course, the game developer Miyamoto with his legacy of games and how he got every gamer to realize Nintendo was not a one-trick pony, and that this was only the beginning.
As the years went on, Nintendo and Miyamoto got more and more popular, so they continued to influence the gaming community. Miyamoto designed the Super Famicom controller, which had the first bumper buttons on a controller, which is another standard in controllers today. The Rumble Pack I mentioned earlier was Star Fox 64 to make you feel like you were actually in the action of the game. But another interesting thing with the Star Fox series is the chip put inside of the game to create the spaceships. Nintendo and Miyamoto wanted to go 3D with their games, and they saw an opportunity with their new game on the Super Nintendo, Star Fox. They created the Super Effects chip that would render 3D images and give them the new effect. While the Super Nintendo had the capability to create a couple 3D shapes on the screen at a time, such as Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, but needed the chip to create several at a time to create the large amounts of starfighters in the game. So if it wasn't for Miyamoto's desperation for 3D images in his games, chances are we might not have had 3D shapes until maybe the first PlayStation. Who even knows if they would make it? Not to mention, with today's Nintendo systems, they have come extremely close to perfecting the motion controls, spawning off several imitators.
Shigeru Miyamoto has a lot to his name, from games to pieces of gaming hardware. And even though he will eventually pass on, these won't. He even said in an interview recently he's quite jealous.
いつかは滅びていくけども、キャラクターはいいですよね。いつまでも年取らないので。今、もうね、今度のスーパーマリオ 3D ランドなんかは、スーパーマリオ3を遊んだ、子供の時に遊んだ人たちが入ってきて、ほんで一緒に逆にそれをオマージュのようにして作ってくれてるところもあって、そういうのがこう繰り返されていくと、どんどんいつまでもキャラクターは生き残っていくんでしょうね。